Antibody drug conjugates have been such a huge advantage in the treatment armamentarium for advanced breast cancer and even early stage breast cancer. So the first in my experience was TDM1, which has really revolutionized the treatment of metastatic HER2 positive breast cancer. And most recently with the Catherine data has moved up into early stage management of HER2 positive breast cancer. Excitingly, just recently, we have the first antibody drug conjugate approved for triple negative breast cancer, sacituzumab, which now will find itself in the setting of third line and later metastatic triple negative breast cancer management. And we just recently have had several new drugs FDA approved for HER2 positive advanced disease, one of which is an antibody drug conjugate, trastuzumab deruxtecan. Antibody drug conjugates, as they've entered our treatment landscape, traditionally have positioned themselves in later line refractory metastatic breast cancer. So for example, we had this experience with TDM1 when first approved, really found itself in the sort of second line metastatic setting. And now with data such as the Catherine trial has moved itself up into early stage disease in patients with HER2 positive breast cancer who failed to achieve a pathologic complete response after getting really good neoadjuvant pre-op trastuzumab-based therapy. We've seen the same paradigm unfold with trastuzumab deruxtecan, which is now our most recent antibody drug conjugate approved in HER2 positive metastatic breast cancer. That has just received an indication in the third line setting and later for patients with HER2 positive metastatic disease. And this follows a very similar paradigm to other drug development where these agents first find themselves in a very heavily pretreated population, but then we hope to move those up earlier into the curative setting when they've proven efficacy. Interstitial lung disease and pneumonitis, similarly pneumonitis, has become an adverse event that as oncologists we need to be increasingly aware of. There have been many drugs that we've used over the years that we know have increased the potential risk for pneumonitis, and often we have been reactive to symptoms or imaging findings. More recently, some very powerful drugs that have tremendous efficacy have also been associated with interstitial lung disease or pneumonitis. So back in 2019, we had an alert that the CDK4/6 inhibitors were associated with a small but risk of pneumonitis. And similarly, with the approval of trastuzumab deruxtecan, we've seen from the data presented that there is a risk of interstitial lung disease, as well as some fatalities related to that in the clinical trials. And so I think that as a breast oncologist and as a medical oncologist, we're increasingly aware of this potential risk and quickly developing experience from guidelines in how to manage this. I think as a practicing oncologist, we likely all have seen some degree of drug-related interstitial lung disease or pneumonitis from the very active agents that we've used over time. I have seen this occur rarely, thankfully, with traditional cytotoxic agents. I've seen this occur with CDK4/6 inhibitors, and having participated in some of the antibody drug conjugate trials, particularly with trastuzumab deruxtecan, I did experience interstitial lung disease or pneumonitis in the context of the clinical trials. And I would say that following guidelines within a protocol is helpful, but now that we have these drugs available to us off study, I think it is increasingly important for oncologists to be aware of the potential risk, be aware of some of the risk factors that are associated with higher likelihood of ILD, and importantly, to understand the management of interstitial lung disease. Our institution participated in the very early and most recent studies with trastuzumab deruxtecan, and I have treated patients with this really powerful agent. And I think what is one of the most impressive takeaways is the incredible responses seen and the efficacy of this drug in patients that were heavily pretreated for HER2 positive metastatic disease. That being said, in the Destiny Breast01 study, about 13% of patients experienced some degree of interstitial lung disease, and there were about 2% of patients on study that experienced fatality as a result of ILD. In my personal experience in using the drug, I did observe a couple of patients with interstitial lung disease, thankfully with early recognition that there was an issue at hand, holding drug, managing it appropriately, following guidelines. My patients did well and recovered, but did need to stop drug. And so I think that it is an important potential adverse event that we need to have early recognition of and early management for. I think foremost, it's important to just recognize that pneumonitis or ILD is a potential risk for patients on a drug like trastuzumab deruxtecan. And having that in your mindset, to recognize that when a patient maybe has an incidental finding of ground glass opacities on imaging, when they are asymptomatic, that sort of grade 1 mild ground glass opacities could be an early indication of ILD. Other symptoms to monitor for on a regular basis are things like a new onset of a cough, particularly a dry cough, or dyspnea, some shortness of breath, or even fever can all be early indications of an interstitial lung disease or pneumonitis. I find that if this potential is in your differential diagnosis, you are more likely to respond and react quickly to this. So if a patient has grade 1 findings on imaging, on a CT scan, I will hold drug and follow guidelines. I will often incorporate the expertise of my pulmonologists on site to be aware and help monitor and co-manage these patients. There's a consideration for the use of steroids when there's an asymptomatic grade 1 concern for ILD. So that would include a dose of about 0.5 milligram per kilogram of prednisolone or its equivalent. If a patient is already symptomatic, then holding the culprit drug is recommended. Instituting steroids at a higher dose of 1 mg per kg prednisolone or its equivalent is recommended. Certainly getting involved your pulmonologist for their expertise. Monitoring of pulmonary function studies is incorporated into that. And I think one thing we've also recognized in guidelines is that when patients improve from holding drug and instituting steroids, we need to be very careful about a slow taper. And that could mean a steroid taper over a period of about 4 weeks. So not to withdraw those steroids too hastily. So I think that we'll find increasingly guidelines that come from publications, from experience with trastuzumab deruxtecan, but we take that potential risk very seriously. And so I would, at a hint of ILD, hold drug, institute these measures, and then monitor for recovery.